Welcome to this analysis of Act 5, Scene 2 of Othello. This is probably the penultimate video I'm going to make on this play. Act 5, Scene 2 is the final scene of the play. It's the scene where Othello murders Desdemona and where then the tragic villain gets a sense of justice at the end. As you're watching, please make sure you're taking notes. There's a template here that you could use to do so. Right, so our plot summary pyramid then, obviously there are limitations to this way of presenting the plot of the play. However, I think it is quite helpful in order to show us where we are in the narrative. Exposition of the play, we've seen the racism against Othello, we've seen Iago, Rodrigo and Brabantio's very negative reaction to his marriage to Desdemona. We've seen Iago then as a Janus-faced character who presents an honest face to Othello whilst trying to manipulate the other characters. In the rising action, we've seen a real increase in chaos and disorder, especially with the fight in Act 2. And then at that point, Cassio starts to speak to Desdemona alone in order to try and get his job back with Othello, and Iago manipulates this to his advantage, convincing Othello that Cassio and Desdemona are having an affair. The climax of the play is one of deception and duplicity and the destructive power of jealousy. So Othello and Desdemona argue about the handkerchief, which Cassio has found and then is given to the courtesan Bianca. Othello has taken this handkerchief as proof of Desdemona's infidelity, and he strikes Desdemona. So in a play which has a lot of violent language, the main actual aspects of physical violence that we see are in Act 2, Scene 3 with the fight, and then much later on when Othello strikes Bianca. And that's quite different to a play like Macbeth, where we see violence a lot more throughout the text. We've seen the falling action of the play, which has been a combination of Othello's increasing corruption and Iago's lust for power, both of which plunge society into chaos and disorder. So in the falling action, Othello verbally abuses Desdemona, who's a much weaker character than she was at the start of the play. Desdemona has prepared for bed following Othello's instructions, and as Desdemona has lost her power, Emilia seems to have gained it and gained her confidence. So in the denouement of the play, we see debasement of previously honourable emotions. And by debasement, I mean something that's pulled down, something that's made immoral or dishonourable or very physical, which is in contrast to the transcendence of Othello's love at the start of the play. By transcendence, I mean that Othello's love rises above all of the social difficulties, all of the contradictions and conflicts that would stop his relationship with Desdemona being successful, whereas here he seems to accept all of those barriers to their love, and he takes action almost because he believes that he's not good enough for Desdemona. And then we'll see in the next video, other characters proceed to attempt to restore order and justice. Whether they actually manage that is questionable. So as I've said, in this scene, Othello murders Desdemona, Iago murders Emilia, and then Iago is discovered and taken to be tortured. Right, in detail then, what happens? Well, first of all, we see Othello entering a darkened bedroom carrying a light. Desdemona is asleep in the bed. Othello determines that he's not going to scar Desdemona's body. Rather, in killing her, he's going to restore her to a state of perfection. Othello then reflects on how death is like putting out a light. Again, maybe a reference to or a link with Macbeth there. Often Lady Macbeth is staged as holding a candle in the start of Act 5, and Macbeth refers to candles and lights as well. But Othello realises that whilst he can relight a candle, he can't bring back the dead as easily. Othello seems to be close enough at this point to Desdemona to smell her breath, and her beauty almost makes him change her mind. He almost remembers that transcendent love from the start. However, Desdemona then wakes up and asks Othello to come to bed. Othello asks Desdemona if she's prayed. He wants her to repent of her sins before he kills her. Realising what's happening, Desdemona protests her innocence, and this is a real moment of pathos for Desdemona as she tries to convince Othello that she is telling the truth. Othello reminds her of the handkerchief. He asserts Iago's honest testimony of the affair, and with every recurrence of the word honest in the play, it builds a real sense of just how deeply Othello has been tricked. Othello then smothers Desdemona, and almost immediately Emilia knocks on the door to tell them that Rodrigo is killed and Cassio has been wounded. Othello unlocks the door, Emilia enters, giving her news and then noticing Desdemona on the bed. Desdemona reawakens and says that she is dying a guiltless death, and then she dies. Seems a bit strange to us that she does wake up at that point. However, we'll talk about that later in the video. Othello admits to the murder, and Emilia lambasts him. When Othello mentions that Iago has told him about Desdemona's affair, Emilia is absolutely horrified and just keeps repeating the phrase, "my husband." She's really trying to make sense of the situation and then to try and explain to Othello actually that he's been tricked. And then at the end of the section that we're going to look at, Emilia calls for help, and we'll look at the rest of the scene in the next video. The staging of this scene is really interesting. So it mirrors that of Act 1, Scene 1. Both of these scenes are set in darkness, and in both scenes a villainous character comes on stage carrying a light. So the play is bookended by darkness, indicating the evil that has been spread throughout society by Iago, and the evil that has become absolutely inescapable by the end of the play. As in Act 1, Scene 1, the light should symbolise hope, purity and moral goodness, but it is actually an ironic marker of the character's malevolent intentions. That Iago carried the light in Act 1 and now Othello carries it in Act 5 indicates just how similar the tragic hero has become to the tragic villain, and in other videos we've talked about the convergence of their language. As Othello is increasingly influenced by Iago, his language becomes more similar to Iago's language, and so here his actions do as well. And this carrying of the light also reminds us that not everything is as it seems. As in Macbeth, fair is foul and foul is fair. It's as if the power of evil manages to reverse everything in the play, to make the innocent Desdemona look like she's committed adultery, to make the heroic Othello commit a very evil deed, and to make the very dishonest Iago look as if he's an honest character. As in Act 4, Scene 3, this final scene is set within the bedroom, and this is the first time we've seen Othello and Desdemona together in a private setting, and so it appears almost to be a perversion of a romantic setting. We would have anticipated in a romantic play, something like Romeo and Juliet, to have seen the lovers together in an intimate setting much earlier on in the text. So if you think about Romeo and Juliet, there's a very beautiful balcony scene towards the start of the play, and then there's the scene after they get married and so on. We don't see any of that in Othello, and so this is really the first time that we see what their marriage is actually like. And the enclosed space and the darkness also contribute to the sense of entrapment and claustrophobia. So Desdemona is trapped in a patriarchal society, and Othello is trapped by the deception of a racist villain. The bed in many stagings of the play is often at the centre of the stage, and it's a symbol of the lost romance in this marriage. In many stage productions as well, it's adorned with white sheets, which, like the name Bianca, represent the tragic victim's innocence. There are a number of interesting speeches in this scene, so I'll just read you the first one, which Othello says as soon as he comes on into the stage at the start of this scene. So Othello says, it is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, you chaste stars. It is the cause. Yet I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow and smooth as monumental alabaster. Yet she must die, else she'll betray more men. Put out the light, and then put out the light. If I quench thee, thy flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore, should I repent me. But once put out thy light, thy cunning's pattern of excelling nature, I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. When I have plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again, it needs must wither. I'll smell thee on the tree, O balmy breath, that dost almost persuade justice to break her sword. Once more, Be thus when thou art dead, and I will kill thee, and love thee after. Once more, and that's the last. So sweet was ne'er so faithful. I must weep, but they are cruel tears. This sorrow's heavenly, it strikes where it doth love. She wakes. So first of all, let's look at what this speech actually means. Well, Othello doesn't name the reasons for his actions, so if you look at those repeated words, it is the cause, it is the cause. So the it is a euphemism. It suggests that Othello really doesn't want to give voice to the real reasons for what he's doing. And then his appeal to the chaste, so to the sexually pure stars, indicates a sense of the rightness of his actions. In Macbeth, we see that Lady Macbeth wants the heavens not to look down on what she's doing. Macbeth wants the Black Knight to stop the stars from watching what he's doing when he kills Duncan. But here it's almost as if Othello welcomes the stars looking down because he believes that he's making the right choice. Othello then says that he doesn't want to taint Desdemona's body, so he compares it to snow and then to a statue. So alabaster is a type of material used to make statues. But he says he needs to kill her to stop her from being unfaithful to others. Othello compares killing Desdemona to putting out a candle, so that's the flaming minister. And he knows he can light a candle again if he changes his mind. But he also knows that once he kills Desdemona, he cannot relume, so he cannot light or bring her back to life again. The romantic metaphor of the rose, or the stereotypically romantic metaphor of the rose, is transformed here as Othello compares killing Desdemona to picking a flower, and this action cannot be undone. And it also seems like quite an easy action as well. It suggests just how far Othello has gone, that he thinks that this murder will be straightforward. Othello then smells Desdemona's breath, the purity of which almost persuades him not to go through with his form of justice. And that's really the level of deception at this point in the play, that Othello thinks that killing Desdemona is an act of justice, that it is restoring a sense of morality to the world because her actions, in Othello's mind, have been so evil, he needs to destroy her. He then says that he'll love Desdemona once she's dead and cannot betray him anymore. So he kisses her one last time and he cries as she wakes up. Let's look at the analysis of this then. So it's notable, as I mentioned on the last slide, that Othello uses the euphemism it. By starting the scene with this lack of clarity, Shakespeare questions the basis of Othello's reasoning for the rest of the soliloquy. That might also suggest that Othello believes Desdemona's infidelity is too horrific to name. And there's a real shift here from the foul language that we've seen in the previous scenes to the elevated language of the tragic hero. So we've seen him talking about toads who knot and gender in a cistern, and actually here he can't bring himself to say that kind of thing. So, as I say, it's a change from that real influence of Iago over Othello's language, and perhaps Shakespeare does that because he wants to elevate Othello here. He wants to start to bring him back up from the debased levels that he's reached in Act 4. Chaste has connotations of purity and faithfulness. Stars symbolise the heavens, perhaps the gods in this play, and also morality. And that Othello directs his soliloquy to them indicates his belief in the moral righteousness of his actions. Then the metaphor of snow and alabaster are things which are both frozen in time. They're both statuesque. They're unchangeable and they're fixed. And Othello wants to destroy Desdemona's ever-changing vitality in life. So he wants to silence her into an unchanging state of absolute perfection. Light, so we've got the candles here, light is associated with goodness, purity and life. And in the Renaissance period, light was also linked with rationality. So we could ask ourselves, is Othello's comparison of Desdemona's life to light an unwitting realisation that she's innocent? Does he actually know that what he's doing is wrong here? Light is also vulnerable and easily blown out, and so it's a fitting symbol for women in the medieval patriarchal society. Promethean might be a word that you're unfamiliar with. In Greek mythology, Prometheus stole fire from the gods and brought it down to earth. Othello alludes to Prometheus in order to express his realisation that he can't do the same, metaphorically speaking. So again, we can start to question Othello here and say, is this a realisation from Othello that his abilities are actually limited? It's quite different from Iago, who seems to think that his abilities are limitless in the play. The rose habitually symbolises romance and love, and here Othello reflects on the destruction of this love. The verb plucked has an understated violence, which juxtaposes with the apparent calmness of this speech. And then here we've got justice, and this is an allusion to a female personification of justice and indicates that Othello believes he is right in his decision. He is only acting for the benefit of society and is restoring balance to an unjust world. And this reveals the depths of his delusion, something that Shakespeare is really going to increase as we go through this scene. Now, a question we could ask ourselves here is, do we feel any sense of pathos for Othello, or is our sympathy purely limited to Desdemona's situation? Now, in Act 4, Shakespeare has really increased the level of pathos we feel for Desdemona. So when Othello strikes her, it's an unnecessary act of violence, a purely gratuitous act of violence. And then in Act 4, Scene 3, the willow scene, Desdemona seems quite pathetic almost in the depths of her melancholy. She's very mournful, she's very sad, she's very vulnerable. And so we do really see her there as a tragic victim. And of course here, as she lies asleep with her murderer sitting beside her bed, again we feel a deep sense of pathos for her. However, one of the purposes of this speech is also to prompt the audience to realise, to really understand that Othello believes absolutely in what he is doing, and he believes that because of the deception that Iago has worked upon him. And so we probably do feel some pathos for Othello here. He's acting because he has innocently believed what Iago has told him. And yes, he's made a mistake, yes, he's blind to the truth, but he is acting within the realms of his understanding of morality. So yeah, we probably arguably do feel a sense of pathos here. Okay, then when Desdemona wakes up, she says, "Some bloody passion shakes your very frame." So it's a good quotation to analyse this one. Othello is motivated by his emotion. So this links us back to Act 2. After the fight that Cassio has, when Othello comes out, he initially starts by restoring order to the scene, but then he recognises that his emotions and his kind of physicality is taking over his rational thought, and he starts to be moved by that more irrational, more emotional kind of prompts. And so it's for that reason that he demotes Cassio almost instantly without investigating what's happening. And so here it's the same thing. Passion, emotion, irrational thought is guiding Othello at this point. The word frame means body. So Desdemona is meaning that Othello's body is shaking. However, part of the greatness of Shakespeare's tragedies is that Shakespeare reveals how, in a moment of crisis, man's very soul can be shaken. And again, we might think back to Macbeth, when the thought of murdering Duncan shakes his single state of man. It's not just his kind of physical being that's shaken by what's happening. It's his whole sense of being, it's his whole existence in this life and the next, which is being shaken or in some way attacked by what's happening. The word "some" here as well shows Desdemona's innocence and her blindness as to what's about to happen. So some bloody passion, she's not sure what the passion is, she's not sure where it comes from, she just has a sense that something's going wrong here. And although she may have had an awareness of what the future might hold for her in Act 4, Scene 3, so in that scene she talks about the marriage sheets as being her shroud, she sings a song at the end of which somebody dies, it's only here that she really starts to understand. And this heightens again the pathos that we feel for her as a tragic. "He smothers her" is also a key line in this scene. Now, the method which Othello chooses for the murder has been decided by Iago, and this shows Iago's ascendancy over Othello. The act of smothering is a metaphorical silencing of the voice of woman. So in a sense, Desdemona is being punished for being outspoken and determined. At the start of the play, she didn't conform to stereotypical expectations of women. So she eloped with Othello, defying her father. She spoke in a public place in front of the lords at the Sagittary. She said that she was determined to go to Cyprus against everybody else's advice. When she arrives in Cyprus, she almost flirts with Iago to pass the time while she waits for Othello. So all of these things have really challenged the patriarchal structure of the play. And here the silencing of her shows that maybe that's what she's being punished for. Maybe Iago resented her strength in a very misogynistic way, and he wanted her to lose her voice. And the fact that she's smothered in the marriage bed points to Othello's sexual frustration, and so this is juxtaposed with the whiteness of the sheets, which we've said symbolises purity and innocence. And this act of violence also shows Othello conforming to the racist stereotypes of Act 1. So in Act 1, Othello claims that the old black ram is topping your white ewe, and the implications of that line are that Othello was violently dominant whilst Desdemona remained passive, and that his race in some way tainted her perfection. Now, Iago has manipulated and stage managed Othello in such a way as this statement is now fulfilled. So here we see Othello dominating a very passive Desdemona and destroying her perfection. So in this way, Shakespeare reveals how Othello has, as yet, been unable to overcome the inherent racism of Venetian society. So instead, he's kind of given in to the beliefs of those around him, and he's acted accordingly. Another key set of lines from this scene are here on the screen in front of you. So Othello says, "Oh, insupportable, oh, heavy hour. Methinks it should now be a huge eclipse of sun and moon, and that the affrighted globes should yawn at alteration." So by this he means that the death of Desdemona is insupportable. He's overwhelmed and he can't endure the suffering that he's going through. Whilst we might find it hard to sympathise with him following the brutal murder that we've just witnessed, and that's kept at the forefront of our minds by Desdemona's body lying right at the centre of the stage, our understanding that it's really Iago that has caused Othello's grief arguably creates that sense of pathos. And the repeated apostrophes, so the exclamation of "oh," reminds us of Act 2, Scene 1, where Othello exclaims, "Oh, my soul's joy." And in that line from earlier in the play, Othello expressed his deep love and happiness. Now the exclamations reveal a grief that is almost beyond words. Othello believes that what has happened should shake the foundations of the known universe. So his frame has been shaken, and now he talks about how there should be an eclipse, the sun and moon should change their orientations, the earth itself should be frightened and should yawn, so should maybe open up in some way. And he uses this metaphorical language to express the magnitude of his sorrow and pain. In doing so, it's also clear that, whilst he's committed a brutal murder, in some ways he's still the Othello of Act 1. He remains extremely eloquent, and therefore is a symbol of how unfounded the racist stereotypes of the Jacobean era were. I mean, what we see here is really a character who's living, existing, trying to succeed in a deeply racist society. And in Act 1, Act 2, he's tried to stand up against that. He's tried to show them that he's done the state some service. He's tried to show them his perfect soul. He's tried to achieve a marriage which transcends those racial divides. And actually, by Act 5, it's as if Othello starts to believe the racism that others are constantly bombarding him with, and he almost descends to that level. He can't transcend those racial divides anymore, and he almost accepts them in Act 4. However, in Act 5, Scene 2, it's almost as if he's on his way back up again. You know, he is becoming again the Othello who, at least verbally, is going to try to challenge some of the preconceptions that the characters have. And particularly here, that's in the way that he speaks. He's not the inarticulate, debased character that Iago wants him to be, but here he's very articulate, very eloquent, able to use metaphorically language in an incredibly sophisticated way in order to express his grief. Then Emilia says, when she comes in the room, "Oh, who hath done this deed?" And Desdemona replies to her, "Nobody, I myself. Farewell, commend me to my kind lord. Oh, farewell." So Emilia's response to the murder guides the audience. It's a little bit like when Macduff enters Duncan's bedchamber and recoils at the horror of what he sees. Emilia shows the audience how they should react to this. Now, Emilia's euphemistic language, so this deed, recalls what Othello said at the start of the scene, and it indicates her revulsion at what's happened, so she can't even give a name to what she witnesses before her. The use of stick Emilia indicates the closeness between Emilia and Desdemona. Now, we know that in iambic pentameter, in blank verse, there should be 10 syllables in each line, or 5 pairs of syllables in each line, and you can see that this deed, Emilia, has 2 of those syllables, and then Desdemona almost picks that line up and says the final 8 syllables, "Nobody, I myself, farewell." And that's called stick Emilia. It's where one character almost finishes another character's line. And it's often used in scenes which show a real sense of closeness between characters. I guess it's a bit like finishing off someone else's sentence because you know them so well. Now, Desdemona asserts here, rather surprisingly, that she's caused her own death. And that reveals her unfaltering loyalty to Othello. So even after he's mortally wounded her, it might seem unbelievable that Desdemona wakes up for a moment, but this device allows Shakespeare to again underscore Desdemona's innocence and to show the audience what true love looks like. It's interesting here that Desdemona refers to Othello as "my kind lord." That "my" has got a real sense of possession, of closeness to him. That very simple adjective "kind" maybe echoes how Othello calls her the gentle Desdemona at the start of the play. It shows that Desdemona still perceives her husband as being a very moral character. And Lord is very different to some of the racist slanders that have been used instead of Othello's name, and that elevates him and suggests her sense of Othello's place in the social hierarchy, but also his sense of integrity as well. Then Othello says, when he starts to explain to Emilia what has happened, he says, "Thy husband, dost understand the word? My friend, thy husband, honest, honest Iago." So Othello means that it was Iago that told me about Desdemona and Cassio's affair. And Emilia replies, "If he say so, may his pernicious soul rot half a grain a day. He lies to the heart." So with the repetition of honest here, Shakespeare intensifies the dramatic irony and the depth of Othello's blind illusion. Now that the memory of the brutal murder is starting to fade in the audience's mind, Shakespeare turns from focusing our sympathy on Desdemona to garnering increasing levels of pathos for Othello. And here Emilia is at her most outspoken. Her mistress has been silent, and now she must provide the woman of the play with a voice. The adjective pernicious means destructive and evil. Thus, Emilia completely rejects Iago and condemns him to hell. The echo of my soul's joy reminds us of how far we have come from the idealistic romance of Act 2, Scene 1. And then that rot half a grain a day, Emilia is wishing a very slow and very painful death on Iago as punishment for what he's done. So what's the function of the first part of Act 5, Scene 2 then? Well, I've showed you these images before and spoken about how we need to oscillate between exploring the big picture, the big concepts and ideas behind the play, and using the finer details to support our interpretations. So the opening of this scene heightens pathos for Desdemona, who's a symbol of the silencing of women within patriarchal societies. It also shows that the act of murder reveals the horrors that mankind is capable of. The murder also shows the speed with which love can transform into hate, warning us against the folly of believing in love at first sight. Iago has forced Othello to conform to the racist stereotypes of Venetian society, revealing how society is perhaps the true villain. External pressures have forced Othello to act in a way that is wrongly expected of him. Then the scene shifts to generate sympathy for the tragic hero, and the depths of his delusion are made apparent in his conversation with Emilia, and the blame is increasingly transferred onto Iago. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and the next video will hopefully be the last one on Othello.